Hello, my name is Jim Cooper, and I'm a historian of the United States based at York St John University, where I'm also an associate head of School of Humanities, where I'm responsible for our programs in history, American studies, and war studies. And this is my turn to ask a question in history. And my question is going to be: was there a Reagan Revolution? Now, I've written a lot about Ronald Reagan in my own work. I've written a monograph about the Reagan-Thatcher relationship, and also a monograph about US presidents and Northern Ireland, where Reagan is a big part of that. Also, have other ongoing work as well about Reagan. So there's many articles and essays and works I've done with Ronald Reagan has been a big focus. Plus, I've taught Ronald Reagan for years, and Reagan still fascinates me. He's a fascinating character. And there's different ways that people have used his legacy since the 1980s in terms of political circles in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party. Historians have approached what is his time in office differently, different emphases about him, and looking at maybe look at the idea of the individual history, the idea of the importance of his character, his policies, his personality, but also looking at the people around him too. So there's always different questions you can ask about Reagan and different ways you can write about the Reagan era in the United States. One thing I love about studying Reagan is, was he just kind of this friendly grandfather figure who was a bit detached, who was a bit of a mouthpiece for conservative interests and therefore detached from the foreign policy making process? Or was he really a very effective politician in his own right with a clear vision for the United States? Did he really win the Cold War without firing a shot, as Margaret Thatcher claimed? Or did Mikhail Gorbachev save his presidency and therefore Reagan's legacy by being prepared to do business with Reagan in the context and after the Iran-Contra affair that perhaps should have led to impeachment, you could argue? Was Reagan really the kind, inspirational figure and character that so many of his friends and allies have told me in interviews that he was? Or was he a very detached man who, as the story goes, only ever had one friend and he married her, and his wife Nancy? When studying Reagan, it's important to think about, was he really a great president, but also the criteria for being a great president. And I agree with a historian called H.W. Brands, a big historian in the United States, and he says there really only three great presidents: there's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And that's because each of them hit the basic criteria of being re-elected. But also, they're both presidents in a great crisis or very important moments in American history. So Washington, of course, was the first. Lincoln was the guy who was president during the Civil War to keep the country together. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt guided the United States through the Great Depression, and you could argue won the Second World War. But was Reagan therefore a transformational president like Franklin Roosevelt has been claimed was? He served as president in 1981 to 89, but Reaganism or Reaganomics, his economic policy, defined the decade, defined the 1980s, and you could easily see how it's defined America and in many ways the world since then. For Reagan's proponents, so his supporters, he was a chap who reversed American decline and wins the Cold War. But Reagan's opponents claim he instead left a legacy of income inequality. He indebted America to the extent that social programs would forever be off the table, and had policies and even some of the rhetoric that laid the grounds for the Tea Party, which of course in turn leads to Donald Trump. Was Reagan a dunce, or was he actually a smart executive? Well, I think he was both. Now, there's a wonderful sketch you could probably watch on YouTube where Saturday Night Live, they portray Reagan on the one hand as the nation's grandfather, congratulating a Girl Scout on her cookie sales. But then, as soon as the Girl Scout leaves the Oval Office, he's back to being an evil genius, multilingual, evil genius behind international affairs and even scandals such as the Iran-Contra affair. So I'll probably put Reagan at the top of the second tier of presidents, behind Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. FDR, of course, was often compared to. Reagan never has to deal with a genuine crisis, but he does change the direction of the country for good or ill. So I would suggest actually there was a Reagan Revolution. Now, this lecture marks 40 years since the attempts on his life by John Hinckley Jr., the chap who tried to kill Reagan to impress a young Jodie Foster. So in some ways, could this Reagan Revolution have been stopped by an assassin's bullet? Well, we'll never really know. This is one for the counterfactual historians. But long suggest actually what we do know what happened was Reagan lived. He goes on and implements Reaganism. So let's find out a bit more about that. Well, in terms of the background from Reagan, many of you may be already be aware that he's a former actor, and he's even president of the Screen Actors Guild at one point. So he's the only ever union leader to go on to become president. And until Donald Trump, he was the first president to have actually ever been divorced. Reagan was originally a Democrat, and he's a Democrat who idolizes Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s and loves the New Deal. But Reagan goes on an intellectual journey in the 1950s, where he becomes very much a leading figure in the conservative movement, or the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Now, Reagan would claim that the Democrats kind of left him rather than him leaving the Democrats. And Reagan's big political coming out party, if you will, is in 1964 when he does a televised address for Barry Goldwater, who is the Republican candidate for president who's going up against Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And this is a very famous speech. It's the Time for Choosing speech, which talks about how the United States and the American people have a rendezvous with destiny. And he very much warns of the dangers of big government. And he says, and I quote, "The founding fathers knew a government can't control the economy without controlling the people. And they knew when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. So we've come to a time for choosing." He also said that you and I are told we must choose between a left or a right. But I suggest there is no such thing as a left or a right. There's only up or down. Up to man's age-old dream, the maximum of individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. Barry Goldwater lost the election by a landslide, but Reagan was the big winner of this election. He goes on to become governor of California, but he goes on to serve 2 terms. He's elected governor of California in 1966. 4 years previously, Richard Nixon, the former vice president, the future president, and the chap who lost to Kennedy in 1960, he lost the governor's race in California. So Reagan wins when Nixon had lost. But as governor of California, even though he'd been a Republican, he has to work with a Democrat legislature. He has to raise taxes. He passed the most liberal abortion law in US history. His policies are very environmental. Lots of conservation works. But his rhetoric, his conservative rhetoric, and his celebrity, and frankly a lack of rivals in that wing of the party, conservative wing of the party, means that Reagan is very much seen to be the one, the leading guy, the torchbearer for the conservative movement in the United States. And because of this, he nearly defeats Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination in 1976. And this is significant because Gerald Ford was the incumbent president of the United States, because he's the guy, of course, who takes over from Nixon when Nixon resigns in disgrace with the Watergate scandal. And when Gerald Ford accepts the nomination, and then Reagan goes on and gives a speech at the same convention, there's a real sense that the Republican Party had nominated the wrong guy. And Reagan gives a speech which talks about how the cause goes on. There are millions and millions of Americans out there want it to be a shining city on the hill. But there's a sense that maybe Reagan's political career will be over after this defeat. But he keeps his presence alive, his celebrity alive, his brand alive, if you will, through regular TV appearances. He has a nationally syndicated newspaper column and radio show. And ultimately, he runs for re-election again in 1980, where he's elected president, where Reagan defeats Jimmy Carter, really by a landslide. He receives just over 50% of the popular vote. He wins 44 of the states, leading to 489 electoral college votes. Now, Carter had endured a difficult 4 years as president. And by the time he gets to the election, this is a time of high inflation, no economic growth, or what's known as stagflation. There's the Iranian hostage crisis, which is just kind of like a bog that Carter and the Americans fall into. They can't get out of this. Every day on the news, it's day 20, day 40, day 80, day 100, day 444 in the end of these Americans have been held hostage in Iran, and Carter can't get them free. Plus, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So you see the end of détente in this time as well. The 1980 campaign sees slogans such as "Making America Great Again." Yes, that one. Also, "The time is now for Reagan." So a lot of the political ads for Reagan end with "The time is now for Reagan." So it's this idea that actually, finally, the American people are catching on to what Reagan's been saying for years. And of course, the killer line from the election is in the sole debate between Reagan and Carter, where Reagan, in his closing statements, asked that question, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" The American people resoundingly said no, and they voted for Reagan. But in Reagan's inaugural address in January 1981, he comes out perhaps the most radical line of all, certainly for the time period. Reagan stands up on the footsteps of the Capitol in his inaugural address after he'd been sworn in, and he says, "Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem." This is a radical thing to say. For the previous 30, 40 years since the Second World War, Keynesian economics has been the dominant idea in economic policy for the United States and also Western governments as well. The idea that actually the government needs to spend money, needs to be involved in the economy to keep things moving again. Reagan wants to reverse this. He says that government is actually a bad thing and not a good thing. So how does all this play out? Well, it plays out in the form of tax cuts. If you read Reagan's memoir, he talks about how after the Second World War, he realised that he'd only make, say, 4 movies a year due to a disincentive, the high marginal rates of tax. That actually, if he made more than 4 movies a year as an actor, he'd be paying 91% of his earnings in taxation. And as a result, he didn't want to make any more movies because there was no incentive for him to do so. But if he didn't make any more movies, others would not work. So for everyone from the cameraman to the catering. Reagan had been a long-standing advocate of lower taxation, but he wants to have a balanced budget as well. In a very famous sketch you can find on YouTube where he goes on the Carson show and he's asked about how do you balance a budget, how do you keep spending controlled? And Reagan makes a joke that it's like protecting one's virtue. Sometimes you have to say no. But by the time you get to the 1980 election, Reagan has embraced something called supply-side economics, which is created by the economist Arthur Laffer. And you get the popular idea of the Laffer curve, where essentially it argues that marginal tax cuts will create supply-side incentives. In other words, if you cut tax rates at the higher end, it creates economic growth, and therefore the economy will grow, GDP will grow, and so on. Eventually, these tax cuts will pay for themselves. Now, Kennedy argued for something similar, but ultimately it was LBJ, his successor, who passes that particular tax cut. Of course, Reagan, being a good politician, talks about Kennedy wanting something similar, because obviously Kennedy is a very popular president still to this day, certainly after, since he was assassinated. So the Reagan administration then sees in 1981, after the assassination attempt, sees the passing of something called the Kemp Roth tax reduction bill, named after Jack Kemp, member of the House of Representatives, and William Roth, the senator. And the idea of this is to revitalise the American economy from this time of stagflation, which Reagan has inherited from Jimmy Carter. And this all comes to fruition in the 1981 Economic Recovery Tax Act, where over the following 3 years, the top rate of taxation in America, or federal taxation, will be reduced from 70% to 50%. This is ostensibly a reversal of Keynesian economics, where instead of high government spending, which creates a deficit to get the economy moving again, you're basically going to leave the money in the hands of the pockets of the higher earners and create a deficit to get the economy moving again. This is all known as Reaganomics. Now, concurrent to this tax cut, you get massive increases in military spending, where Reagan wants to kind of up the ante, if you will, in the Cold War, to try to bring the Soviets to the negotiating table. We talked about peace through strength in his campaign. There's also reluctance to cut spending elsewhere, particularly in social security. So just Reagan loves his tax cuts. He wants to defend high defense spending. The Democrats refuse to cut social security, so like pensions and so on. So he creates a big deficit. Now, the Reagan administration were not all necessarily united on the idea that tax cuts would pay for themselves. So David Stockman, who was the director of the Office of Management of the Budget, he warns that there will be deficits due to the tax cuts combining military spending and so on. Reagan predicted that there would be a balanced budget by 1984 because the tax cuts would be self-financing. However, as the deficit increases, Reagan feels the pressure. He works out a deal with Congress, and he actually raises taxation, the biggest tax increase in American history up to this point, through the 1982 Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act. The administration returns, though, to its tax-cutting agenda with the 1986 Tax Reform Act, which, for instance, simplifies America's tax code at 50 and 28% levels rather than 14 different tax brackets. So what Reagan does in 1986, he takes 6 million Americans out of federal taxes, lowers taxes for 60% of Americans, increases them for the wealthy 15%, but it's unchanged for about 25% of Americans. Now, this is when the politics for this really comes in. This is a standoff in terms of economic policy between Reagan and Congress. On Reagan's coattails in 1980, there's more Republicans elected to the House of Representatives, but the Democrats still control the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is a chap called Tip O'Neill, as a Democrat. But the Senate goes Republican for the first time. It stays that way for a few years. So a bit of a standoff happening where essentially the Congress doesn't want to reduce spending, especially on entitlements and Social Security, but Reagan wants to reduce spending and also wants his tax cuts. So you get a strategy effectively of starving the beast. The Reagan people settle on the idea that we're just going to cut off Congress's allowance, if you will, that they'll simply have to cut their spending if they really care about the deficit. Of course, the public support entitlements, and they want their Social Security and so on when they get older, but also they like the tax cuts. And also military spending for the Cold War is important for Reagan's grand strategy towards trying to end the Cold War. So here's some statistics then which show the impact of all this, where in 1981, the US national debt stands at $908 billion. By the end of Reagan's presidency in 1989, it stands at $2.7 trillion. However, GDP grows by a third. In the 1980s, the average after-tax income of the top 1% rises by 73%, just over 5% for the middle quintile of households, but there's no increase for the poorest quintile of households. And many of the new jobs that are created are actually low paid, and there is a big decline in manufacturing. Millions of ordinary families rely on borrowing or having to have two earners. So the idea that you just have to need one breadwinner, if you will, that goes away. But poorer job security emerges as well. And this is due to 250,000 corporate buyouts, mergers and restructuring, and there's a big increase in homelessness in urban areas. What about the size of government? So Reagan, he's cut his taxes, but has he managed to get to grips with the size of government? Well, Ronald Reagan cuts about 30,000 jobs from the civilian payroll of just over 1 million in the 1980s. Now, this 3% cut seems quite small, but Carter actually added 50,000 in 4 years, and George Bush Sr. goes on to add an extra 100,000, his Reagan successor, from 89 to 93. Only Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton since 1950 have actually reduced federal civilian employment in the federal government. In terms of government regulation, in the 1950s and 1960s, there's a steady increase in the Federal Register of government regulations. Jimmy Carter sees 75,000 extra regulations added on average each year, which comes to a total of almost 90,000 extra pages of the Federal Register by the time he gets to 1980. But Reagan is the only president to have not issued more rules and regulations than his predecessors. But this is when we kind of critique his environmental record, where the Secretary of Interior and the EPA Director, the Environmental Protection Agency, they resign in disgrace, and there's very little enforcement of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. So this decline in regulation, government regulation, has an environmental impact, which of course is a bit contradictory to his time as Governor of California. The big debate about economic policy in the 1980s then comes down to government spending. If you're going to have this tax cuts and this defence spending, what do you do about government spending or rest of government spending? Well, there's certainly in the federal government there's something called mandatory spending. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt. And these things are difficult to change. In terms of defence spending, this is subject to an annual debate and vote, but Reagan has managed to increase defence spending every year. Then what's left is something called non-defence discretionary spending, things like education and so on. And this is what folks mean by government spending. And this is where the political and ideological battles are fought annually in the 1980s. And Reagan's been targeting this kind of slice of the federal budget since the 1950s. Between Kennedy and Carter, government spending, so this non-discretionary spending, increases in real terms by 78%. And 20 years after Reagan has left office, it increases by a further 86%. But under Reagan, it falls by a third. So Reagan then is the only president in 50 years to slow and reverse any increase in federal discretionary spending. And Reagan's supporters loved this. So he's right up there with Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s, the guy who actually did reduce all spending and reduce taxes and balance the budget. But opponents of Reagan simply abandoned government's duty to help people. So what about other key areas then in domestic policy? Well, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he said, and I quote, that Reagan's cutting the heart out of the American dream to own a home and have a good job. And he's still popular. Also, of course, elsewhere in domestic policy, you have the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. Where Reagan's response to this is very, very slow, delayed, and controversial. You also have what many people, social workers in America, call the feminization of poverty in the 1980s. You also have a big influence of the Christian right. There's a decline of trade unions, which arguably starts by Reagan's crackdown on the striking air traffic controllers in 1981. The air traffic controller union in the United States, they endorsed Reagan in 1980, and they thought that a deal that he would go on to support an improvement in their terms and conditions. They're all federal workers. But when they go on strike in 1981, he gives them all basically 24 hours or 2 days to return to their jobs, or they'll be terminated. He fires them, and they all get marched away, even in chains. There's also, of course, revival in the civil rights movement in the 1980s. This be inevitably to get a conservative president of the United States with some of Reagan's past rhetoric on African American issues. This made this inevitable. But Reagan, and Republicans today forget this, he grants a pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants. He has an amnesty in the mid-1980s. So, in terms of the culture of America, big question is, how could a divorced Hollywood star become the daughter of conservative Christians? Ahead of Jimmy Carter, of course, was a Baptist minister. Reagan even appoints the first pro-choice woman in Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. But Reagan also views gay men and women as equals, but then he also ignores AIDS. Reagan, he just has the support of the religious right in America, the group of people who emerged as a political force after the 1960s, 1970s because of Supreme Court decisions on Roe versus Wade, and the women's right to choose, or the fact there should be no public prayer in public schools, so regular state schools, and the fact that Darwin should be taught. But they support Reagan despite this because he's prioritising the economy and the Cold War, and the Cold War talks about in very much religious terms of the evil empire and so on. Reagan's waging a campaign against a godless evil empire. He does have an appallingly slow response to the AIDS crisis. But Reagan also enjoys this endorsement of evangelical conservatives, and he brings them into the Republican Party tent for the culture war in America. So it's because he's prioritising certain things. He talks the talk, says the right things. They support him, even though Reagan doesn't do anything on public prayer and in schools or abortion rights or anything like that. And of course, in all things in history, context is king. Ronald Reagan made Americans feel good about themselves again. This is a country that just had Jimmy Carter, the Vietnam War, Watergate, the sense of losing the Cold War. And he made Americans feel good about themselves again, even after the Iran-Contra affair, where Reagan, his administration, they did break the law. They sold arms to Iran. They shouldn't have done. They pocketed the profits, which should have gone to the Treasury Department, and he illegally gave money to the Contras, the rebels against the leftist regime in Nicaragua. And Congress said outlawed this. So he broke the law on 3 occasions. This part of this Iran Contra, look it up, is absolutely extraordinary. But Reagan's forgiven. He goes on TV and says, even though the evidence says that I did break the law, in my heart, I didn't. It's not true, and they buy it. So Reagan then he leaves office with a 53% average approval rating, and in 2004 his retrospective approval rating by Americans is 74%. Only Kennedy has a higher approval rating. Reagan's highest approval rating in office was 68%, which he reaches twice. In May 1981 and in May 1986. May 1981, a few months after there's that assassination attempt on him, he's got his tax cuts passed. And in May 1986, but the lowest point was in 35% approval rating in January 1983 at the heart of the recession. Also, Reagan did well politically, but the Republicans had the Senate for the first time in decades for 68 years of his time in power. The significant gains in the House of Representatives. Reagan has a good relationship with Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House of Representatives, but O'Neill, he welcomes him to the big leagues, as O'Neill says in 1981. But then he can't believe how effective the Reagan administration is in getting Democrats to vote for his tax cuts in the 1980s. Reagan and O'Neill have a lovely relationship in many ways, where they tell Irish stories together, they drink together, they have fun together. And I think perhaps the most moving story is when Tip O'Neill retires as Speaker of the House of Representatives in the late 80s, and Reagan goes and he gives a story where it says, Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't, I'll give my ticket away and I'll go to hell with you. And O'Neill's got tears in his eyes at this big event because Reagan would like to go to hell, rather go to hell with him than go to heaven. And it's a great book about it. It's by Chris Matthews, as the broadcaster in America who used to work for Tip O'Neill. And it's just very much an example of high journalism. It's only a good read, though. It's called When Politics Worked. Now, Reagan and his policies, they were divisive, as you can see by that approval rating in 1983. They were divisive. He's unpopular at times. The economy was going badly, but of course the economy picks up in just in time for his re-election campaign in 1984, when all the ads said it was morning again in America, and Reagan wins in a landslide in 1984. Now, historians are now writing about Reagan as opposed to perhaps more partisan accounts and memoirs and things from the 80s and the 90s. So some great examples are Ewan Morgan's Reagan, an American Icon, published in 2016, and he talks about how, in some ways, Reagan's greatest achievement was the conquest of inflation in the early 80s, which leads to the stable conditions for investment in what would become a computer-driven economy of the 1990s, although the cost of this was a deep recession, 1981 to 1982. And Morgan talks about how there's this prolonged economic growth from 1982 to 2007 in the United States, but the cost is a huge income inequality gap. Doug Rosennell's book, The Reagan Era, from 2015, he writes about how there's a winner-takes-more society that emerged in the 1980s. He says how Reagan's tax policies reinforce this trend towards inequality. But he says Reagan can't take all the credit for this because monetary policy, with high interest rates till 1983, devastates manufacturing, killing off forms of egalitarian pay and tens of thousands of union jobs. So he also blames the policies of the Federal Reserve, not just Ronald Reagan. And in my own work, I write about how Reaganomics was effectively neo-Keynesianism, where it was deficit financing to get economic growth. But rather than tax cuts to get the government spending, you're doing that rather than having spending on government programs and so on. As I mentioned earlier, there's H.W. Brands is a great historian in the United States. So I encourage you to really check out his work and to watch his videos on YouTube. He's a fantastic public speaker. And he says that Reagan does compare favourably to FDR in many ways. In his book, Reagan, The Life in 2015, he writes about how Franklin Roosevelt enters office amid a crisis in the private sector, when a conservative status quo politically has lost its legitimacy, and Roosevelt tips the balance politically to the left. And abroad, he asserts American leadership and defeats fascism. When Reagan becomes president, there's a crisis in the public sector, which is floundering amid a liberal status quo. And therefore, he tips the political debate to the right and revives conservatism in America. But also, in terms of policies abroad, Brand says that Reagan confirmed American leadership and helps to defeat communism, albeit with a little bit of help from George Bush Sr. when he becomes president in 1989 to 1993, and of course Mikhail Gorbachev. For Brands, Reagan's keys to his success is the fact he really was the great communicator, the best communicator since Franklin Roosevelt in his fireside chats. But for Brands, this isn't really due to his acting background, but instead it's because Reagan believes in what he's saying about America, and Americans want to believe what he's saying too. Unlike Carter, there's no impression that Reagan is blaming the American people for their problems. And unlike Kennedy, Reagan administration and the US government under Reagan is not asking the people of anything. He's just giving them the gift of tax cuts. Crucially, he also says that Reagan's success comes down to the fact that he's a pragmatist, not a purist. Reagan, as far as he was concerned, he learns this from when he's the president of the Screen Actors Guild. A union leader, if he can get 4/5 of his goals in a negotiation, he'll take it. And he's very willing to come back for the rest later on. Also for Brands, I think he's right in this, that people may have loathed some of Reagan's policies, but they didn't loathe him. They liked him. Reagan was the best storyteller since Abraham Lincoln in American politics. And the point is, if you can get people to like you and to laugh with you, you're halfway to getting them there to agree with you. Go and check out some of Reagan's jokes. Honestly, some of his jokes are absolutely brilliant. An introductory book I'd recommend to read about Reagan will be James Broussard's Ronald Reagan, Championing Conservative America in 2015. And Broussard says that yes, there was a Reagan Revolution, and he bases this on the fact that there was cuts in discretionary domestic spending, bureaucracy and regulations. But he says it was only temporary because ultimately, spending went back up and regulations and government jobs went back up in the 1990s, or certainly has since Bill Clinton. So it's only a temporary revolution, as far as Broussard's concerned. Also, according to Broussard, 40% of Americans identify themselves as conservatives, but political science said they're actually philosophically conservative and operationally liberal. So many people simply prefer cuts in federal spending over tax increases, except when they are programs that actually benefit them. It's a lot of this because of the personalisation of politics, where things might sound good until it affects you personally. What do I think? Well, I think it's rhetoric that matters the most in politics. Reagan challenged and even challenged the popular idea that government was good at doing things and that government was a good thing and the government should be trusted. Remember, we must not forget what he said in his remarkable statements in his inaugural address. Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Reagan's rhetoric, the talk of tax cuts, the evils of government, sets the agenda for the Republican Party since the 1980s onwards. This is how you get Newt Gingrich's Contracts in America in the mid-1990s. This is perhaps how you get the Republican Party today. Reagan's rhetoric and his message sets the agenda for the next 40 years. And I think, in some ways, the best way we can summarise this is actually through Barack Obama, the 44th president of the United States. When Obama was running for president, and when he was a mere senator, Obama, he said, and I quote in 2007, I'm not going to be as eloquent as Barack Obama, so do look up this quote yourself, but what he says, and I think we'll conclude with Obama, Senator Obama from 2007. I think Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in a way that, Richard Nixon did not, and in a way that Bill Clinton did not. He put us on a fundamentally different path because the country was ready for it. I think they felt like, with all the excesses of the 60s and the 70s, and government had grown and grown, but there wasn't much sense of accountability in terms of how it was operating. He tapped into what people were already feeling, which was, we want clarity, we want optimism, we want to return to that sense of dynamism and entrepreneurship that had been missing. Thank you very much for watching. please do take a moment to complete the very brief survey embedded in the blurb below. And if you have any questions, do please get in touch with us. You can get in touch with us via York St. John, and our contact details on the website. But also you can find out more about us via Twitter and our blog for our program. And that'll be in the YouTube blurb as well. Thank you very much for listening and for watching, and appreciate your time, and take care of yourselves. Thank you and goodbye.